The next example is an example of a piecewise defined function. A piecewise function is a function that is given to us in pieces. We have a function that behaves differently for different values of the domain. So this function says that when x is less than or equal to negative 2, the function is equal to negative 1/2 x plus 2, and the function is equal to x minus 3 when x is greater than negative 2. So to graph a piecewise defined function, graph each of the pieces for the values of the domain that they're defined for. So let's first of all look at this first part of the graph, and let's just make a little f of x chart to see what's happening. It says that this function is defined when x is less than or equal to negative 2. So we're going to start with negative 2. And if we plug negative 2 into our function, we'll have negative 1/2 of negative 2 plus 2, which is equal to 3. And then we want values that are smaller than negative 2. So let's do the same thing and enter in negative 3, and we'll get 7/2. And if we plug in negative 4, we get 4. If we plug in negative 5, we get 9/2. So if we wanted to graph this part of the function, we're going to start at negative 2, 3. And then at negative 3, we're at 3.5. And at negative 4, we're at 4. At negative 5, we're at 4.5. So this part of our graph looks like that line. Next, let's look at the other part of our graph. And so if we're going to graph part 2, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make an f of x chart. And notice that this is defined when x is greater than negative 2. But to get your graphs to work out nicely, let's go ahead and imagine what would happen if I were to plug negative 2 in. Well, I would have negative 2 minus 3, which is equal to negative 5. Now that is not a value on this graph because it says greater than negative 2, but it's my starting point. So I'm going to circle that so I will know that that's not really on the graph, but it's my starting point. And then I want values that are greater than negative 2. So if I enter negative 1, I get negative 4. If I enter 0, I get negative 3. If I enter 1, I get negative 2. So now let's go over to our graph paper, and I'm going to start at negative 2, negative 5. But I'm going to make an open circle because it doesn't really include that point. And circling that negative 5 on my paper will help me remember that. At negative 1, we're at negative 4. At 0, we're at negative 3. At 1, we're at negative 2. And so this half of the graph looks like this. And this whole graph all put together is the graph of f.